So here, like here, yeah, excellent. Now here we're live.
Oh,
So
now we're live.
now we're live.
Okay,
Finally,
very
yeah,
good.
we're live. Yes, great, great that we are here today with another sessions, our live webinars. Ask Me Anything. Every week we have different guests where we discuss about what's happening in AI, but not only that, so how people are building with AI. And it's fantastic to have you here because until now we had primarily AI builders, those who are doing AI applications. But it's the first time that we have someone really who is coming from another perspective, who's coming more from a platform perspective, who sees things differently. And it's fantastic basically to expose our audience of AI builders this other view of how things are done. And also from your wealth of information that you have, because also you have your own show, you also have like a lot of things that you're doing, right? Like you're always talking some conference and so on. So
Yes.
great that you're here today with us.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Yeah, it's good to be here. I hope that what we do will be interesting for people. And yes, I have quite a different background. I'm not primarily in the AI space. I mostly work with APIs. I've worked with companies who have products in that space, who have API management products, API gateways, and so forth. So mostly I come from the side of things where organizations have large landscapes of digital assets, so they have all kinds of things that they are capable of doing in a digital way.
Yeah.
And oftentimes they have a hard time managing that past a certain size, right? Because they have tons of different teams and systems and capabilities. And if you just ask them, I mean, that's always my first question is like, how many APIs do you have, right? And very few organizations know that because there is most of the time there is no central place where you could go and look, right? And I think in the AI age that becomes more and more important because you could do so many things, but to do those things you would need to find where to point the AI agents and the AI model training and whatever, right? And I think that's where I come in basically from that side of things.
Yes, no, that's really fascinating. So, and when you ask this question, what's like the most common answer? How many APIs do companies have?
Well, the most common answer is we don't know. And whenever they give me a concrete number, I just say wrong, and they can't prove me that it's right. Yeah, so it's different. It depends, of course, very much on the size of the company. But I mean, larger companies have easily hundreds, sometimes thousands, sometimes over 10,000 APIs because they have so many systems, and each system oftentimes exposes a number of APIs, and they have SaaS products they're using, they have partners they're working with, so those APIs are important as well. So they just have a vast ecosystem of information that they potentially could use. But it's hard to keep track.
What should become an API? So now you're saying this is so important in the age of AI. So if someone is building an AI application, they might thinking, hey, I might want to expose this as an API. I might maybe some internal services create an API, wrap it around an API, and so on. So when should something become an API, and is there like a checklist for that?
Everything should have an API, at least coming from the API side of things, right? So that's always my disclaimer. That's kind of where I come from. There even is this pretty popular concept of API first, right? Where you say what we're building, we first design that as an API. So we say, how would somebody interface with that thing in a digital way? So if I wanted to write a program that used that capability, what would that program consume, right? And then that's how you start by thinking about like what would you want to get in terms of information from that capability, what would you want to do with it, and then that's what driving actually your design process. And the same way as like in the olden days, right, you would start by designing a UI, right? So you would have wireframes and ask people, how do you like that, right? Would you want this button here, this button there? So you would ask people, if I were building this, how would that work for you? And an API first, you do the same thing, just with an API. And ideally, I think that's how you should ideally build everything and say, whatever I'm building, if it's good, it's pretty likely that somebody wants to integrate that someplace else, right? They want to have it as part of an automation process. They want to have it as part of a different application. They maybe want to just use parts of the things that I'm exposing. And if I'm not having an API, that's not something people can do, right? So then they actually have to build some crutches around that. So typically, I think everything should have an API. Huh. That's a tall order.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And how do I go about building one? Okay, so you're saying, okay, everything should have an API. Then what's the next step? So what should I check? Or what should I have in mind?
Yeah, you could follow a process relatively similar to what you would do if you followed that UI-based approach, right? So if you start building a UI, you also first you try to find users that would be interested in what you're building. If you cannot find any users that might be interested, then why would you build it, right? So you start finding users, and then you start making these sketches, right? And you say, hey, if you have these things that you want to do, how would that work for you? And then you work through that. You build some easy, simple prototypes that you can easily build. And you sit down with them and you observe them going through your thing, what works, what doesn't work, where they're wondering, like, how do I do this, right? It's like, what does that mean? It's like, why can't I click this, right?
Yes.
And the very same process you can follow with an API. You write a first sketch of your API and you share it with users. You maybe ask them to build a UI for it and see whether they can actually do that or whether they struggle with understanding what you're even doing. And the question how you do that, so sometimes there's one method that Micah Munson, who's pretty popular in the API space, in particular for API design, like he has this idea of API stories. So very similar to user stories, you have API stories where you would say, this is how I think somebody else would want to use my API. Maybe they want to automate things, right? So they want to use what I'm building, but they have other things as well, and they want to connect up all these things. So how would they connect my thing into that new automation they're building? And those stories then help you to better understand what would they need, right? So they would need to maybe search for things, they would need to retrieve certain things, maybe they would need to update certain things, whatever it is that I'm building, right? But those API stories then help you to understand what interactions would look like. And then, I mean, nowadays, I was just teaching a course with Mike actually in New York a couple of weeks ago. And there, what we did, because it's so easy nowadays, we have people writing these stories for APIs, and then they just feed them into an LLM, right? And say, create an open API description for that. And what's coming out of the LLM is not terrible. You know, it's what you would usually expect from these kind of exercises, that it's good enough to maybe have a couple of iterations, have first discussions, have first prototypes, have mocks, and then refine that over time. But that's what the process would look like. And there's so much tooling in the API space, right? Where when you have, let's say you have an open API definition that you maybe got from an LLM, now you can just feed that definition into a mocking tool. So the mocking tool is something you can run locally, or there are web-based ones you can use. So the mocking tool then spins up an API that will actually respond to requests and send responses. That's based on fake data because it doesn't really implement any logic. But you can start playing around with it. So you could, for example, start building a simple interface, user interface that works with that mock, right? So that means you can already give people something to play around with, in the same sense as for user interfaces, you also would want to have feedback from potential users as quickly as possible, so that you can improve your design and end up with a better design.
You just mentioned now open API, and not everyone might know that, right? So people know, okay, there's an API. What's an open API? An API that's open. So for those,
don't say that, please.
For those who don't know, what's that?
Yeah. I love the fact that you were saying an API. So we had to fight that for quite a while, actually. But by now, I think people understand that open API, without a pause in there, is not an open API. So you can make up all kinds of confusing sentences and say, my open API is described by open API. That is a valid sentence.
Yes, it is.
You could also say, the API that I describe with open API is not an open API.
Okay, so
I'm just trying to confuse you.
Let's just get some light. So open API, it seems that it's some organization, it's some standard, it is some protocol.
So I was just like pulling your leg a little bit. Yeah. So open API don't read it as open API, right? It's not about an API that's openly available. It's an open standard for API description. So the open really is that it's an open standard. It's not owned by any organization. It's a non-profit that is developing that standard. So it's a standard-based description for APIs. It's right now the most popular one that's used, let's say, for widely available APIs because it's based on HTTP. So it's for APIs that are based on HTTP interactions, so the web protocol, and that in most cases will be using JSON payloads. So, and then there's an open standard that allows you to describe that API, where you start with endpoints. So you describe these are the endpoints that exist. So these are the URLs that we all know from our browser address bar. And then you say what kind of methods these endpoints are accepting. So can I send a GET request? Can I send a PUT request? Can I send a POST request? All the different types of requests that HTTP supports. And then you say, maybe I can send additional data. And then you can also say, what kind of data can I send and what kind of data would I receive? So you also define the payload, basically, that goes back and forth. And that already, from a developer point of view, gives you a pretty good understanding what your interactions with such an API would look like, right? So you know, I can send this kind of JSON to this endpoint with a GET request, and I can expect this kind of JSON as a response. And I shouldn't have said that because you are not allowed to send JSON in the GET request, so strike that. But anyway, right? And then you already have a pretty good understanding of how that API works on a mechanical level, right? What are the interactions I can do? You don't understand at that level what all of that means, right? So what actually happens when you send a request? Do I order something? Do I pay for something? Do I search for something? So that's something that then you will find more in the documentation, right? So there's also documentation you can associate with those things. But that mix actually of having the mechanical description and also allowing you to document things in addition to that makes it very useful as a description format that people can easily consume and easily understand.
You just brought out this topic of documentation, and something that I see, for example, with open APIs, one requirement is pointing out where is the documentation located. And however, these days, or since always, it's been the case that one can have an API, but this API is not documented, right? And I maybe even argue that in most organizations, that may be the case, that there are so many APIs and so on lying around, but rather the knowledge is on the developers, the knowledge is internally on the people and so on, but not necessarily there's here some URL, some document where things are here located. And LLMs, AIs, they need documentation, right, to understand how they work. So it seems that on one side, documentation is essential, but this is one of these ungrateful things that nobody wants to be really working on. And therefore, there's not much. Or if it is, maybe it's even very like a bare bones, incomplete, outdated, etc. Are there best practices, or is more a bit let's say, doing exercise and eating healthy that even you might not like it, you still have to do that because you need that?
So the best process to follow, I would say, and that doesn't really help so much with existing APIs, so to speak, at least, but going forward, not making the same mistakes. The best process to follow would be to really always treat your open API description kind of as your source of truth. So you really treat that as this is what defines how my API works. So you put all the information in there, and then you generate other things from there. And there are tons of tooling that allow you to do that. So you can generate documentation, you can generate SDKs, you can generate test cases, you can generate all kinds of things from that open API description. And if you do that, if you really see that as something that is driving your process of managing APIs, then almost as a side effect, your open API description is always there. It will always be updated properly, right? Because this is what you start with. And you will also focus to really do all the things that you should be doing, such as having good documentation, having maybe additional things that you want to have for your APIs, such as good examples and these kind of things. That doesn't help you much for existing APIs, but I mean, so the most extreme case is that sometimes you have APIs that are kind of not described at all, right? They're implemented, so
Yeah.
you can use them. You can send a request because you know that you can, but you don't really know what to send, right?
Yeah.
Maybe somebody told you at some point, you wrote it down or whatever. Um, in that case, I mean, you can do it in hindsight, right? So you can start kind of doing a little bit of API archaeology, right, and try to figure out what does that thing actually do. There's tooling out there that will actually allow you to generate open API descriptions from traffic logs, right? So you could look at, if you have access to traffic logs, you could say, well, I see this API has received these 10,000 requests and it has sent these 10,000 responses. Based on seeing these requests and responses, my best guess is that this is what the open API description should look like, right? And that may be wrong because maybe there are additional things the API does that you did not see in those 10,000 or 1,000 examples that you have, but it's something, right? So that's another thing that organizations sometimes also use, where they generate those descriptions knowing that these are not really the full truth, but at least maybe they're better than not having anything.
Mm-hmm. And so if we think about this age of AI, um, when you advise organizations and they say, hey, we want to start seeing how we can introduce AI in our processes, we want to start doing things, we're still in an age where people are just thinking around, right? Just seeing, what can I do with that? I need to do it because we got the mandate from our board, do something with AI, and then we're here figuring out. Are there some suggestions that you have that you can say, hey, these are like the, I don't know, let's say low-hanging fruit, or the 1 to 3 that you should try out, you should do with this API that you have, with this, maybe this documentation that you may be highlighting around? Are there some things that organizations can try out, let's say today, and see some results with AI?
So just for clarification, when you say using AI, I would say there are at least two very different things where you can use AI in the API space, right? So one would be that you use AI tooling, right? So you use some kind of tooling that you maybe also used before, or maybe it's a new category of tools, but you use that for managing your APIs, right? That can be, maybe you use it for documentation, maybe use it for testing, maybe use it for finding APIs, maybe use it for other things, right? So there are a lot of tasks where people try to improve the quality of tooling by having some AI in those tools, right? So that would be one way of thinking about how can I use AI in the API space. The other thing would be, which is I think fairly orthogonal to that, would be to say, I want to use my APIs for building applications that are somehow driven by AI, right? So I want to build agents and these kind of things, and those agents should be able to use my APIs, right? So that, I think, is a very, very different question. And then we have a third one, actually, right, which also now is getting increasingly important, I think, even though it's more a little bit of a specialized niche, where then the other question then would be is like, if I have more and more applications that are using AI services, shouldn't I have some component there in the middle that is controlling all of this, right? So if, for example, I have a number of applications in my organizations that are using some LLMs, should all of these call the LLMs directly, right? Just go directly to the OpenAI API? Or should those go through some centralized point so that I can better understand what's going on? Maybe I can also, that helps me with understanding how much money I'm spending for tokens. Maybe I can also sanitize inputs and outputs. Maybe I can do throttling. So I can do a lot of things there as well. So there would be more than that third thing where you could say you're using APIs basically to build up a better infrastructure for API consumption throughout, AI consumption throughout the organization. So which ones of those do you want to talk about?
Well, I said the first one is intuitive in that, so of course, already developers and also just So business stakeholders that are using all type of assistants, chatbots, tools, and so on that are powered by AI. So that's a little bit obvious that okay, just start using ChatGPT, right? But what about this second and third part? Because those are very interesting in that. So the third part sound to me like a little bit like there's these API bosses and so on, and all these boss architecture, etc. And maybe it's that, or it could be something different that I see these days. There are LLM gateways, so it's a way to control that. So I'm very curious to see.
Yeah, that's like the term that I have seen being used mostly, but I think it's still early days, right? But it's that people call these AI gateways because they're specific kind of for AI associated services, right? And they're a gateway in the sense that you have the services here, you have people consuming those services, and somewhere in the middle is the AI gateway that controls that in some shape or form.
Yes. Now that we're talking that, let's start there. So should the company build their own AI gateway, or is it something that they should go to GitHub and find what's available, or how should they go about that?
I don't think that you should build that yourself. It's that, so to me, sounds like the same way. I mean, that's where I come from, right? So like 10 years ago, we still had companies building API gateways because they thought, oh, we need one and we don't like the 10 ones that we could buy or just use, so we built our own. But I think that really has become a thing of the past, where organizations are also realizing that's really expensive, right? And it's not just building it, but you also need to manage it as a living product, right? You need to update it, you need to patch it. So, and that's probably not something that creates a whole lot of value for you. So both for the API gateways of the past, so to speak, and the appearing class of AI gateways that you now see, there quite a number of the API gateway vendors now also offer AI gateways because they see that as like an area to branch into. Right? So I would definitely encourage everybody to seriously look into those offerings and consider adopting those, because it's like the famous term I had with my team back then when we were still encountering people who were building their own API gateways, right? Like a lot of really, really problematic software project started with how hard can it be, right?
It's very hard.
Yeah, right. So the same for API gateways, right? Like it's like how hard can it be? I just whatever, right? I just have this little thing and I just use whatever, some proxy, and then build a little bit of extra stuff around it, and then it grows and grows and grows and grows, and then somebody's like, that's actually pretty hard. And the same, I think, will be true for AI gateways, right? So unless you have a really, really compelling reason to not use the ones that are out there, don't build your own. And before you start building your own, get in touch and let's have a talk.
Why would you say that AI gateways are hard? What makes them hard? If intuitively one say, hey, it's just here connecting to some APIs, maybe like it's basically like a wrapper of LLM APIs of sorts, right? So what would make it hard to not build it in-house?
It's just adjusting to enterprise needs at some point, right? So then you get new consumers, you need to onboard those. Maybe they actually are using or want to use different security schemes. Now you need to start implementing new security schemes that typically aren't that trivial to implement. Maybe at some point in time, also the providers for LLM APIs. So right now it's relatively easy because everybody seems to have decided that we're just implementing the API that OpenAI has created, right? So you don't need to adjust to many different providers, but that may change, right? They may start exposing different interfaces. So then you have to build adapters to those, right? And say, oh, this new provider that we really want to use because they have a really good model, but they have like a funky API. So now we have to implement support for that funky API to pull it into our gateway. So you're doing all this infrastructure work that probably a lot of other companies are doing as well, or need to get done as well. And this is always like, this is where somebody should step in and do it well and provide that as a service. And you just say, okay, I'll give you some money and I don't have to do that, and that's a good deal.
Mm-hmm. And taking this like from a more global perspective, in AI, what is it that companies should be doing in-house? What is it they should be getting from other vendors? Where should they identify what's their competence, what's rather something that's better served by someone else?
Now we're venturing into AI land, which is hard for me.
But from a perspective, right? Because in theory, I imagine that often, for example, from a team, one says, okay, everything is like an API, right? And then so it doesn't matter. And if it's like internal, external, what matters is just that it follows this so perspective, this structure, right? Follows the open API standard. So can it be seen like that, or do you think that there are things that you might think that maybe organizations might do it in-house? For example, thinking so here on so here APIs, right? So should organizations be writing tooling for generating documentation from AI so models in that, let's say I feed in my open API so descriptor, and then I want to have back my documentation, or should I use, I don't know, some tool that's around? This could be one thing. Also, for example, thinking about, for example, so ideas for APIs is like diagnosis, right? So is my API so available? Is it compliant? Is it like some fitting those criteria? Should I write this tooling for that internal tooling, or should I go and then shop this around?
So there's this wonderful thing that I don't know whether you've seen it, but the API Days is a big event around APIs. I'm at many of those events. And the organization behind those API Days, they have a, I think, blog, I don't know, website that's called API Scene. And what they publish, it's called the API Landscape. And you can Google that, API Landscape. And it's just a fascinating, they had that as a big poster once. It's just a fascinating overview over all the different players in the API sector, right? Who do stuff like all kinds of tooling, and they have all these categories of what kind of tooling exists and how many vendors are, or how many open source projects are in that space. And you can filter it and slice it any way you like. Looking at that, you really understand that pretty much anything you do in that space is something that a lot of other people are doing as well, right? So doing that yourself, again, with this, how hard can it be, is in many cases not such a great idea. And I mean, we just went to this event today, right, where we talked about AI things, and there we had the same question there, and I think the answers that were given there was very good. Basically, it was about asking yourself, which of the things that I'm doing are really differentiating me as a company, right? So is the value that I bring that I have better, let's say, better models. LLM level models, right, than anybody else. So we had one of the panelists, right, he was actually in a company that do that. And for them, it makes a lot of sense to really build their own models, right? But building your own models is really, really hard. And also building a model that is better than OpenAI's models is also not easy. They're pretty good. So that you need to make a strong case for that, right? And I would say for 99.999% of cases, you would need to say, having my own model is just not what I should be spending time and money with.
Yes.
I should pick the best model that I can find for the problems that I want to use. Maybe I learn a little bit how I can fine tune it, or I can tweak it in other ways, right? Do a little bit of RAG with it or whatever it is. But like, I find ways to take that model and adapt it better to my needs. But I think that is actually what we will see, where a lot of value is being brought into the AI landscape, where more and more people will help you better understanding what is out there, what parts should you get for the problems that you want to solve, how should you combine them, where should you maybe put in your own effort, so that you get to what you want to do as quickly as possible, right? Without spending energy on things that are not really a differentiator for you.
The API Days, this is basically like the go-to event for everyone building APIs to be at the forefront, correct?
It's a very big event. They have, I don't even know, this year I think they had like 10 or 12 events or something like this. Maybe the next big one is coming up in Paris at the beginning of December. It's a couple thousand people. This one, right? It's a big event. I mean, APIs are just, there are a lot of APIs out there, right? And every organization, like 100% of organizations on the planet are using APIs. But it's actually what I find interesting, why this is for me personally really such an interesting and valuable event, is that it's not just for developers. So it's not just where you can learn about the tools to design and develop and whatever, work with individual APIs. They also have a very strong focus on managing the ecosystem, right? So if you're in an organization and your job is actually to kind of maintain that landscape of 1,000 or 10,000 APIs, how do you do this? So governance and oversight and these kind of things. So they have a lot of specialists talking about these things, and there's a very good community around this as well, which I think makes it particularly valuable for large organizations because they're all struggling with this.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a good community.
And right now, so given that those who are participating and those who are there speaking, they're at the forefront, what's currently in their minds? So what's currently top of mind for API leaders these days?
For API leaders, governance. The three things important for APIs are governance, governance, and governance. I think that's almost true. Because we have, right, it's like, it's not, we're getting more and more of them, right? So we have a lot of them, and then we say, oh, this is hard to manage. And we're getting more and more of them because we're digitalizing more and more things, right? So our digital footprints are growing and growing and growing. And it becomes harder and harder to manage those things. So you, on the one hand, you have this pressure of managing this growing footprint. On the other hand, in particular now with AI, you also have the pressure from leadership saying, we should do AI things, right? And we have so much data and so many things, so why don't we do more AI things? And that also means that you have to probably better organize your assets so that they're easier usable, and also big thing, they need to be securely usable, right? So we've all heard these stories of some AI applications or some agents just doing strange things because they all just work non-deterministically, right? So they may have some ideas that are not entirely what you want to happen. So having some model of how you can securely try out things, and you can safely try out some ideas, and then you have a safe environment where you can do that, and then say, okay, based on what we've done so far, now we actually feel confident to roll this out. So I think getting ready for this more AI-oriented wave of applications that everybody's hoping for, I think that's also very high on the list of things to do.
Governance, when one hears that, often one thinks it sounds like a very enterprisey committees, boards. I love like here so discussions, etc. But practically and pragmatically, what means API governance?
Yeah, so there are different ways of doing it. So governance, and that you can just use the regular kind of layman's interpretation of the word, right? Like if you have a government, it can also work in very different ways, right? You can have a dictatorship where there's this one person saying everything that happens and that's all there is, right? Or you can have complete anarchy where everybody does what they think is good for them, or maybe even for everybody, but like there's no coordination and stuff just happens in a completely chaotic way. And you maybe just hope for things to turn out well. So this is the spectrum of governance, right? And for a while, things were more trending the way that you're saying, like very heavy-handed, complicated processes. People mostly were thinking of governance as something that is holding them back, right? So it's mostly like a term that for most people has negative connotations. Right, It's like, I was feeling that from yours, like governance. But it doesn't have to be, right? And I think in large organizations, I think it's fair at least to admit that if you're a large organization not doing anything, basically hoping that things will self-organize is very risky, right? And very few organizations are doing that. Then how what else they're doing is a question. But nowadays, so people are trying to move away from that, because that also was typically slowing things down. People had to wait for approvals and those kind of things. So one of the things that really helped a lot with that, and that's kind of a different community, I would say, a different trend, is this whole trend of platform engineering, right? So platform engineering, I would say, is originated more from the DevOps community. So the idea, right, in DevOps basically is teams should should own a lot of what they're doing so that they can move fast and they don't have to have these handovers. And then once things have been deployed to production and you want to make changes, it becomes very hard to do that. So DevOps told that story very well, but it didn't really talk about scaling, right? So it didn't say, what do you do when you have 100 DevOps teams? Because now you have 100 teams trying to move fast, which maybe is great, but
yes,
but they may all start using different tools, and then you have like complete mix of tools that maybe is not great. So platform engineering then emerged from that, saying, if we still like that DevOps model, but we want a little bit more coherence in what these teams are doing, we provide them a platform that makes it easier for them to do certain things. So let's say, very simple example, they want to have a repository for code, right? So instead of telling everybody, pick whatever you like, right? And one team goes with GitHub, and the next one goes with GitLab, and the next one goes with the Azure version of that, right? So instead of doing that, you just provide something in the organization as part of the development platform, and you make it easy to use. And the easiest option for a team then actually is to say, oh, we're using that, right? Instead of thinking about what other tool to use, we just use what's made available for us, right? So that's the general idea of platform engineering, is to try to make it easier for teams to move fast. And then kind of the side effect of that is that the easier you make it for teams to move fast, the easier then, or the more likely it also is that they actually all use your platform.
Yeah.
And so you get a little bit of this governance, right? It's a little bit more implicit, so to speak. It's not that you tell them you have to use it. You just make it easy for them. And if you're doing it right, they might even say, thank you, right? Thanks for helping. Now I can do what I wanted to do. And that's kind of the more modern way of governance, which is less heavy-handed and tries to figure out better ways how to do that. So that's, I think, what a lot of organizations are trying nowadays to establish this platform model. So team topologies. Have you heard of team topologies?
Like vaguely?
Yeah. So team topologies has been instrumental in at least accelerating this trend, right? So we just had the second edition coming out like 1 or 2 months ago. I think the first edition came out like 5 years ago or something. And they established this model, a very simple and easily comprehensible model of, you have stream-aligned teams who are kind of the ones that really try to get products out of the door. And then you have platform teams who are in charge of building those platforms and helping the stream-aligned teams to move fast. And then you have two other kinds of teams. But I think they really popularized this model of saying there are teams that try to move fast, and then there are other teams whose job it is to help with that, right? And I think that really helped to also understand that this model probably works well. So you see more and more organizations adapting some version of this model. And I think that's the more modern form of governance that more people can live with, right? And they wouldn't get your reaction saying like, governance sounds bad. and people, like most people who in that space wouldn't say that team topology helps with governance, because that word is kind of loaded and not positively for most people. But I think it does, but in a good way. So
we have actually a comment from Mer Griffin that says that they're building the AI integrated ISO manager for complete management systems, ensuring compliance with legislation, including governance. And here, seeing this is, what comes to your mind, Erik, when you see this? So, for example, also compliance is like another word here, right? And not only governance, but also compliance. I was thinking, compliance comes more from the business side. Governance can come more from the engineering side and so on. Here, how do you treat both? Because often these compliance teams, they're seen in some legal organization and so on in the large organization, whereas here this API governance is more on the engineering side. And then you're saying in the past, for example, DevOps said, okay, everyone should be empowered, so everyone gets their own tooling and so on. So in all these organizations where there are so many stakeholders and also so many terms that ultimately they try to basically align what one is doing with requirements might be internal stakeholders and also external ones. So GDPR, data privacy,
Yeah,
PII,
there are a lot of these
etc.
things as well, right? So if you're let's say your business, your area of business is building medical devices,
Yes.
right? So that's like so different from being Facebook, right?
Absolutely.
So it's a very different environment, and you have different legal requirements, right? You have different probably ways how you want to conduct yourself. So in both cases, you might follow slightly similar approaches, but in one case, you would still have, I don't know that area very well, but I'm sure if you're building medical equipment, there are a lot of gates that you have to go through, right? It's not that somebody would just in the evening decide, oh, let's push that to production. Like if it doesn't work, we'll fix it tomorrow, right? So no, like the 5 people have to sign off. If things go badly, you go to jail, right? So it's a big difference, right? So I'm not quite sure what Mayor is referring to there, but I think for those more, let's say, regulated areas where there is more quality control that you have to put in place, right? Their governance just becomes a necessity, right? You cannot just say, oh, I don't like it. It's like, well, it's just like, we have to do it. It's not even a discussion.
Yes, and something that's coming out to my mind is also the topic of like ownership for APIs. So who should be building, maintaining, and basically distributing the API, popularizing into the organization? Should it be the team that's basically creating the service? If let's say like I have let's say like an internal AI wrapper, so I don't know, maybe connecting with OpenAI to something and so on, and then suddenly someone says, hey, that would be really good to have it as an API. Should be me as the provider of this a wrapper that is preparing the API, maintaining it, documenting it? Should be like the platform team who takes the ownership and create like a really good API? Should be someone else? It should be like distributed the competences. What are the best practices for that?
That's a good question. Ideally, it should be so. So if you follow through with what we discussed earlier with that API first idea, right? Yes. It's naturally the team that's building the thing, right? Because that's their first job, is actually to design that API, and then they build the thing, but they first think about the API. So if you follow that, it's very natural. If you don't follow that, or if you have existing services, I would still argue that you should get the API ownership as close to the actual capability as possible, because otherwise you'll always end up with these frictions where if anybody wants to change the capability, right, they have to make sure that the API that's owned someplace else, right, doesn't break. So then that creates friction and makes things slower. So ideally, you really want those things to be in one place. I think the further away they are, the more you get to the point where it's really hard to change things. And ideally, if you design your APIs well, right, and they're used by, let's say, multiple consumers and all these kind of things, you want to be able to change, right? Like if somebody says, hey, I like your API, but I really need those 2 things as well, right? And if you decide, okay, sounds good to me, I'll do it, right? Then that should be an easy process and shouldn't be something where now you have to coordinate with other teams, like, oh, what happens if we do it, and so forth.
Yes. You're mentioning exactly about this idea that API first, maybe like an API-driven development. And this really memories that I have a friend that comes more from this API land. We work on some projects together, so from time to time. And always when we're coming together, how he works is that first he creates mocks for APIs. And if we like the responses, then we build a logic. And I come more from a perspective of more like, let's say, like test-driven development. Yeah. First, I do the unit test and so on, and then if I like it, then I'll build. And then for me, more like the APIs, let's say like satellites, ancillary, but I will not see it as, let's say, like the cornerstone of how everything is built. Whereas for him, it's first, as you're saying, so here the API as a mock and so on, response everything, and then after that, we do everything else.
But isn't that at some level very similar what you're saying? So where if you follow this idea of designing first and then building mocks, right? You're trying to spend as little time as possible up to the point where you can start having discussions, right? It's like giving it to somebody and say, do you like it? What should be different? So forth. If you do test-driven development, it's kind of the same thing, right? You try to get very quickly to the point where you say, I have a complete behavioral description of my system that I was able to get to without actually writing any code, right?
Yeah.
So it's the same. I would say at this level, it's actually very similar in the sense that you try to do, and maybe by today's cool terms, we could say both of these are actually kind of instances of what people now call specification-driven development, right? Where like this kind of thing where they have now taken the kind of the prompt engineering term. I think that's not cool anymore. And vibe coding doesn't really work well. So the idea then was like, okay, we should probably try to get to a result by writing down what matters as quickly as possible, right? So I think these are all, I mean, they're all different things, but they follow the same principle, I think, trying to write down what matters as quickly as possible with as little technical overhead as possible so that you can start doing interesting things with it.
Yes, I guess here is a little bit of philosophy for development where, so he comes from a perspective of, as you're saying, everything should be an API, everything should be exposed. Whereas from my side, maybe I come more from this side of, first is internal logic. I develop that, and then if it works, then I expose it as an API. And if there's also need for an API, then I will expose it, because I always think APIs means more moving pieces, more services, things can go more wrong and so on. It also means the more things that I need to align and have like this cognitive overload, etc. Whereas if I'm thinking more from a monolithic perspective, I have an internal logic.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I've had that discussion a fair bit actually, where in large organizations, sometimes some teams are, I think, actively hostile against exposing APIs, right? Because they say, well, then more people are using my stuff, and who knows what they're doing, right? So I almost don't want that because it sounds like more work for me. But I think this is where you just kind of need to really then at some point take the bigger perspective, right? And say the goal of the organization in itself is not to make the individual teams happy, right? The goal is to make the organization as effective as possible. And I'm sure you've heard of the Bezos mandate.
Which one is it?
Jeff Bezos. So it's very old. It's from 2002.
Wow. More than years here.
And the story goes that in 2002, Jeff Bezos issued a mandate to his teams. Back then, right, they were just building the world's biggest online store, but AWS didn't exist, right? So they were just building massive compute facilities because they needed that for running Amazon.com.
Mm-hmm.
And he realized that this is actually kind of a big deal. So the mandate was every team that is building a capability must expose an API. I don't care what it looks like. It can use any technology that the teams want to use, but it must be something that another team can consume, right? Where if this team is building something and that team wants to consume this thing and make it part of what they're building, they don't have to integrate or have meetings. They can just do that, right? And that was very radical at this point because it said, right, like everything that's getting built must have an API. And the famous, I'm forgetting now about the five, it had 5 parts. And the last one, because it's Jeff Bezos, said, if you don't do it, you're fired. But the point, so there are 2 interesting side tracks to that story, right? So the one thing is, it was very, very, very expensive because back then you didn't have nearly as many tools as nowadays, right? And they realized, now when something goes wrong, we have to trace it back. Actually, kind of debugging becomes much harder because there may be things happening and we have to figure out what happens. Also, we might have situations where if your component has a problem and is starting to kind of call my component 1,000 times per second, you're basically attacking me and taking my service down. And maybe you didn't want that, but it's just because there was a bug, right? So you have to defend against those things. So they discovered that actually building this out was really hard. So they went through like years of actually making it work, right? So that's the number one thing. By which I just want to say, this was not a decision that was in any in any way for the short win, right? It was a very strategic decision saying like long term, this is what we need. I don't care how much work it is. Let's get going, right? And that was a very, very strong leadership call, right? Basically saying this. And the other thing I wanted to say about that story is like, I mean, this is why we have Amazon Web Services today, right? Because they very quickly realized if I am building a very good storage service that a lot of components are using, I can actually also sell this, right? I can provide it to others. And if I have designed it well, and if I have the right mechanisms to manage it so that it can be easily consumed and is stable, then I can offer this as a service to everybody out there who wants to store a lot of data and don't feel like building their own data center, right? And I don't even know when. So I think the first Amazon Web Service that was released was S3, I think, the storage service.
Yes, I think it
Was that 2005 or 6? I don't, like one of those years, right? So,
Yes.
but it really it kind of followed that Bezos mandate, right?
Yeah.
So, and then of course they released more and more and more services, and now it's a whole huge thing in itself, right? But what I want to point out is just that this is really kind of the transformative effect that this can have, right? That you even become a totally new business because of that. And that may not always be the case. But I think that's really where if you want to even make those things possible, then you have to really play the long game and not just tell people, if you don't feel like building an API, that's fine. So always build APIs.
Yeah, so encouraging. Now it says here with like this Amazon, so with AWS and Amazon story, right? Like AWS now is basically like a multi-billion-dollar business. So who knows? This is
I think multi-billion, I think, is really cutting it, selling it very short. It's much more than that. Yeah, I mean, it's unbelievable. Yeah. Oh, and by the way, I have a YouTube channel.
Yes.
And I have a video about the Bezos mandate. So maybe we can link to that.
It's a really good way to plug it. So,
Yes.
so tell us about your YouTube channel. What people can find there. What you're talking about there. So tell us more.
So I have a YouTube channel. It's called Getting APIs to Work. It's over 5 years old now. Wow. So I started it quite a while ago. Has a good number of videos. I think it's around 250 now. It's mostly me just talking with people in the API space. Sometimes it's practitioners who are just doing that in their organization. Sometimes it's tool vendors who have cool new ideas or release new things. Sometimes it's with people who have published books or published new things. Sometimes it's just me talking about technologies and stuff I find interesting. So if you're interested in APIs, check it out.
Can we get APIs wrong?
Oh, yes.
What's been like
you want more details?
Exactly. I'm very curious. So here, like
well, I mean, there are many. I don't know. It's like there are countless ways in which you can get them wrong. I think one of the ways nowadays that, because it's your AI focused channel, right? Like one way I think that you can get them wrong that nowadays also is very relevant is when they're too fine-grained, right? So when your API has many endpoints, and in order to do anything meaningful, you need to combine like 30 different things, right? So if you're explaining something to somebody where they want to do something simple, it's like, how do I create a new customer, right? Then you have to explain them, well, you have to do these 30 things, right? That's not a great API. That never was a great API. But maybe people could get away with it more easily. Nowadays, in particular in the age of MCP, that becomes problematic, right? Because agents tend to have a hard time to put those 30 things together in the right way, right? So they become inventive, or they become confused, or they misuse things somewhere in the middle. So what's much better would be to have one API interaction that would say create customer, and that would just wrap those 30 things for you, right? And it would always be executed in the same way, so you know that these 30 things happen, and then your agent has a much easier time figuring out what that is.
Yes.
They know, okay, this is how I create a customer. great, I'll do that, right? I don't have to think about how to do those 30 things. I just do that one thing and I'm done. So I think that's where we need to move to. We've always advertised that in the API space for the longest time, that your APIs shouldn't be too fine-grained, right? They should be more oriented alongside your business processes, what matters at the business level. And I think, I hope actually that with AI now, maybe putting more pressure on that maybe we actually see those practices getting followed more, because maybe the incentive is a little bit higher. Because if you don't do that, that was a starting point, right? Then you really have a bad design that probably makes it hard for agents to do things well.
Wow, you just brought up MCP, and this is basically like a topic for a full discussion, but we'll
well, we have 3 more minutes or something. So
I want basically to, maybe I said like a good point for like a future session is, what is currently, so for all the API community, in their minds regarding MCP? Are they like maybe like afraid? Are they curious or excited? Where does the community currently stand there, considering that MCP is a very different way in some senses from the classic here way to doing APIs and interacting and so on? Is there like a reason people say, hey, maybe we're the next dinosaurs and they will replace us with like MCP engineers or whatnot?
It was kind of interesting. So last year at these API days, Paris, actually last December, I just walked around and asked like a couple of people I knew, just like, how do you think the API space is changed by AI? Right? And I asked, I don't know, like 20, 30 people. It's on my YouTube channel. And
watch it.
Very subtle. But anyway, it was interesting. It was a big spectrum of responses, right? So some people said, oh, we don't even need APIs anymore. Yeah. To which I was asking, then how do you do anything? But anyway, I never got a good response to that. But the other half, or the other extreme, was to say, oh, we don't really care about AI, right? It's just another consumer. It's just API is for consumers, AI is just another consumer, right? I would say, and you'll find people all along the spectrum, right? So personally, I'm somewhere in the middle. I think that APIs actually will be more important than ever, and I think we see that in people more invested into governance, right? Like some interest in that new tooling and so forth. But I also think that AI has some really interesting differences to traditional API usage that we still need to better understand and adjust to, right? Because we don't have the developer anymore, right? We used to create APIs for developers, right? So you would assume that there is an intelligent person with some background in their head, probably some experience, right? So if I didn't do a good job with describing my API, you could compensate for it a little bit, right? Because you're smart and have experience. And we don't have that anymore with AI, right? So AI is smart in some ways and very dumb in others. So we really have to take that difference into account. And I think, we probably should talk about that at great length at a different moment in time. But I think that's what you see nowadays. I think what people are doing at times now, where you can get tooling that generates an MCP server for your API. Right, that's just an automatic process. So that's an easy thing to do. I don't think that's a good thing to do, because oftentimes you end up with way too many tools that will be confusing for agents. And more importantly, we had the discussion, right? If you're an organization that has, let's say, 1,000 APIs, now let's say per API you have, let's be conservative. Let's say you have 20 endpoints. And on average, you probably have one operation per endpoint. Let's put it like this, right? So then now you have 20,000 endpoints, right, in your organization. That also means if you now just blindly generated MCP servers, you would have like 20,000 tools that an agent could choose from, right? And that's a really, really hard selection to make. So I think the real challenge actually is to think about, how do I get to a point where, for an agent that wants to complete a certain task, I give them a fighting chance to find the right things among those 20,000 things, right? And my claim would be, you need good search, you need good ranking, you probably also need higher level APIs to reduce that overall number, you need better descriptions, right? And all these things will go into the mix. But I think that's something where we're really just getting started. That's what my company is working on, right? So I work for Jentic, and we're in that space as well. But that's why I joined, because that's what we're doing, and I think it's super interesting, and I think it keeps the API space just lively and interesting and evolving. So yeah, it's something that I'm really excited about.
Fantastic. And here to wrap it up, where can people find you online, Erik?
On LinkedIn and YouTube, those would be the two places. Just plug in my name. You'll find me.
Perfect.
Get in touch. Yeah, get in touch. Hey.
Thanks so much, everyone. So as you know, every week we're having these discussions every Thursday, 4 p.m. Ireland time. Thanks so much, Erik, to be here this week with us. And then we should subscribe to your channel. So many cool discussions there. And contact you on LinkedIn, right?
Yeah. Contact me on LinkedIn. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. That would be great. And thanks a lot for this interesting chat, Rod. It's great. And let's have another one just where we just talk about MCP. I think that actually might be interesting for a lot of people.
Let's do that. So
okay.
Well, until next time.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Hi. Stream.